The first thing they did was toss my husband's muddy work boots into the trash, the ones he'd left by the back door, laces still tied, caked in the rich, dark soil of the forest. He loved Caleb. Did it with a dismissive flick of his wrist as if he were clearing away clutter before a real estate showing Sloane. My daughter didn't even flinch. She just murmured something about streamlining the entryway. They did this before the ink on Arthur's death certificate was more than a week dry, before the scent of the funeral lilies had fully faded from the hall. They interrupted me 21 times while I was reading his will. The will, he wrote with a trembling but resolute hand in the final weeks before the sickness took him. I stayed quiet. I swallowed every casual insult, every thinly veiled suggestion, every greedy glint in their eyes. They thought I was too lost in grief to notice. But my mind was a diamond, hard and clear with loss before the lawyer arrived, before the final act of their breathtaking charade was set to begin. I had pressed a small hidden button. The tiny red light, no bigger than a pinprick, blinked once from beneath a silk napkin on the dining table, and what it captured would shatter the pristine image they had built for themselves. Brick by fraudulent brick. It was the kind of morning that was unique to the Oregon coast. The air tasting of salt and damp pine fog clinging to the tops of the ancient Douglas firs like a shroud. Arthur would have called it perfect weather for mending fences. He believed every dawn brought with it a task, a purpose for 42 years. We had shared these misty mornings, our hands wrapped around coffee mugs, our silence a language of its own. Now the silence was a vacuum, a screaming void, where his low chuckle should have been. It had been 8 months since I'd lost him. My Arthur. My anchor in every storm that morning. I retrieved the portfolio he'd left in the bottom drawer of his roll-top desk. It was a handsome thing of worn, oiled leather. A relic from his own father inside, nestled amongst schematics for a birdhouse he never got to build, was his final will. He had penned it himself, despite the perfectly typed and notarized version our lawyer Miss Reed had on file. Arthur was a man of sentiment and substance, read this one to them. Cordelia. He had whispered, his voice a dry rasp. I want them to hear the timbre of my voice in yours. It matters that they see your face when you say the words. That was the part that had fractured something deep inside me, because today they were all descending. Caleb was flying in from a glass and steel high-rise in San Francisco. Sloane and her husband, a man whose personality was as sterile as his electric car, were driving down from Seattle. I'd already fielded their calls all week, a barrage of thinly veiled inquiries. Not "How are you holding up, Mom?" Not "Is there anything you need?" but a relentless drumbeat of questions about the estate, the accounts, and unlocking the potential of the land. When your son, a man you taught to tie his own shoes, refers to your home as a legacy asset in an email. A fundamental bond has been severed when your daughter suggests converting the old growth forest into a curated glamping experience before she's even heard her father's last wishes. You know you are standing on the precipice of a great betrayal. I walked into Arthur's study, the air still thick with the scent of cedar and old books. I placed the leather portfolio on his desk, my fingers tracing the deep scratches in the wood. His favorite chair, a deep burgundy wingback, sat empty. The leather worn into the perfect impression of his shoulders. The last cup of tea he'd brewed sat cold on a coaster beside a stack of birdwatching guides. I hadn't had the heart to move it. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath, braced for the coming storm, and perhaps I was too. Because I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that the words on those pages were Arthur's last, desperate attempt to remind his children of who they were meant to be. I had a quiet, treasonous thought, then one I dared not speak aloud. Maybe Arthur wrote that letter knowing they wouldn't listen to him. Maybe he wrote it so I could hear myself say the words aloud, so I would stop, second-guessing the cold, hard truth. I already knew they weren't coming to honor their father. They were coming to liquidate his memory. Sloane was the first to arrive, her Tesla gliding silently up the gravel drive like a predator. Her husband remained in the passenger seat, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone. She stepped out, dressed in sharp, minimalist beige, her heels crunching on the gravel with an impatient rhythm. She didn't glance at the porch swing Arthur had built, nor at the riot of wild roses I'd tended for decades. She swept inside, calling my name as if summoning a maitre d'. I heard the refrigerator door open and shut, a proprietary sound that grated on my nerves. Caleb arrived 3 hours later, reeking of airport lounge whiskey and ambition. There was no apology for his tardiness. Just a weary sigh as he dropped his designer duffel bag on the floor. His first question was about the Wi-Fi password. Not a word about the house. Not a glance at his father's portrait over the mantelpiece. Just a demand for connectivity. They convened around the mahogany dining table as if it were a boardroom. Sloane opened her sleek laptop. Caleb produced a thick binder. They launched into a full-scale presentation, complete with pie charts and architectural renderings. They spoke of the Blackwood experience, a luxury wellness retreat they showed me, mock UPS of minimalist cabins replacing the ancient woods, a yoga pavilion where Arthur's workshop stood, and a spa overlooking the very cliffs where he and I had watched eagles soar. They didn't even use our family name. Blackwood was now a brand, a commodity to be exploited. Caleb laid out the strategy as if it were a foregone conclusion, peppering his speech with terms like zoning variances and investor interest. Sloane chimed in with market projections, her voice a smooth, persuasive hum. She talked about wellness, tourism, and optimizing equity. They were not asking for my blessing. They were briefing me on my new reality, framing their avarice as a favor to me. "It's the smart move," Mom Caleb said, his tone laced with condescension. "It'll free you from the burden of this old place. You can finally relax, as if my life here woven into the very fabric of this land had been a burden. As if my peace hadn't been shattered the moment they decided to turn their grief into a business proposal. When I finally asked about Arthur's will, they exchanged a fleeting conspiratorial glance. Of course we want to honor Dad's wishes," Sloane said smoothly, "but we have to assume he wanted what was best for the family's financial future." Caleb actually laughed, a short, ugly sound Dad never liked to see an asset underutilized. Then he slid a document across the table. It was a power of attorney agreement, granting them majority control, 70% of the estate's assets. My name was typed in bold at the bottom, a dotted line waiting patiently for my signature. I didn't say a word. I just stared at the paper, their voices fading into a meaningless drone of numbers and projections. Then I rose, walked into the adjoining sunroom, and gently closed the French doors behind me. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the cool glass, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. There was no anger, no fear, just a profound, chilling clarity. I finally saw them for who they were. This wasn't about love or legacy. It was about leverage, and they were certain they held all of it. They believed I would crumble, a relic of a bygone era. They had no idea about the steel that was forged in the heart of a woman who had loved a man like Arthur Blackwood. They had no idea what was coiled and waiting inside me the next morning. The living room had been rearranged. Caleb had pushed the comfortable chintz armchairs to the walls and placed 3 stark modern chairs in a semicircle. Sloane had lit a sandalwood-scented candle to create a calming atmosphere. She'd said it did nothing but fill the air with the cloying scent of their artifice. I came downstairs, holding the leather portfolio inside. Arthur's will was folded, once the paper thick and creamy. His signature penned, just 3 days before he went into hospice, was shaky but defiant. His instructions were simple. Everything was to be shared equally, and I was to read his handwritten words aloud, with no lawyers present. Just family. I stood before them as they sat expectant. The pages trembled slightly in my grasp. Not from nerves, but from the immense weight of what was about to unfold. I took a breath and opened my mouth to begin. "Before you start, Mom," Caleb cut in, "did you have a chance to look over the zoning prospectus? I left for you. I think we should honor your father's request and begin with the will." I replied, my voice even. He gave a tight nod, but before I could utter another syllable, Sloane interjected. "I agree. It's important to hear Dad's wishes, but it's also prudent to view them through a modern financial lens. It's about responsible stewardship." I ignored her and began to read. I wasn't even 2 paragraphs in when Caleb interrupted. Again. "Did Dad really write this himself? Or did Miss Reed help with the language?" "This version is entirely your father's," I stated. My eyes fixed on the page. I heard him mutter something under his breath. I continued reading. Sloane stopped me next, her brow furrowed in feigned confusion. That term, irrevocable trust. Could we just clarify the implications of that? "We will get to that part," I said, my patience fraying like old rope. She smiled, a placating saccharine gesture. "Just want to make sure we're all on the same page." I began again. They kept interrupting. They asked about capital gains tax. They questioned the notarization. They challenged the dates, the phrasing, the intent behind every sentence. They interrupted me 21 times. I counted each one, not on paper, but in my soul. Each interruption was a chisel, chipping away at the sanctity of the moment. Arthur had envisioned. They weren't listening to his words. They were scouting for loopholes. When I finally reached the last sentence, a profound realization washed over me. They had no intention of honoring anything. This was not a reading. It was a hostile cross-examination. I looked at their faces. Caleb was idly tapping his Mont Blanc pen against the arm of his chair. Sloane was discreetly scrolling through her phone beneath the table. I quietly folded the will and placed it back in its leather sheath. "We're done for today," I said. "The lawyer will be here tomorrow afternoon for the official proceedings." Sloane nodded, her relief palpable. "That's probably for the best," Caleb stood, stretching. "Good. We can circle back on the equity split later. I've had a few thoughts on optimizing the structure." I didn't reply. I walked upstairs to the bedroom Arthur and I had shared for 4 decades. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands still, my breathing. Even the anger had burned away, leaving only a cold, hard resolve. They thought they were wearing me down in truth. They were forging me into a weapon. They had no idea that I had just begun to truly listen to them, to Arthur, and to the fierce, protective voice inside me that night. I retrieved the small, high-fidelity audio recorder Arthur had used for his bird watching. He'd kept it tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of Walden. I checked the battery. It was still good with silent, deliberate movements. I slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan. The next morning, Miss Evelyn Reed arrived at precisely 10 Podern. She was a woman in her late 60s, with intelligent eyes and an air of unflappable calm. She greeted Caleb and Sloane with a polite but distant nod before taking my hand in both of hers, a gesture of quiet solidarity. I led her to the dining room. The recorder was already in place, nestled under a linen napkin beside my water glass. Its tiny microphone aimed at the center of the table. Miss Reed opened her briefcase and began. She stated that Arthur's will had been filed, confirmed, and was legally ironclad. She explained the terms of the irrevocable trust with painstaking clarity. Caleb tried to interrupt, twice. She silenced him with a raised finger and a look that could freeze fire. Sloane asked a question about flexibility. "There is no flexibility, Mrs. Blackwood," Mrs. Reed stated simply. "That is the very nature of an irrevocable trust. The allocations cannot be modified." I saw Caleb's jaw clench. Sloane crossed her arms, her composure cracking. Mrs. Reed continued. "Arthur left specific instructions. The house and its immediate grounds remain in Cordelia's name for the duration of her life. The remaining acreage and all financial assets are to be split equally among his 3 children. She paused, letting the words land that includes the share designated for his late daughter Lily, which is to be held in trust for her son Leo. A financial advisor, Mr. Alistair Finch, had been appointed to manage Leo's trust until he turned 25. Furthermore, Arthur had established a significant memorial scholarship in his name at the State University for students pursuing environmental science. He had funded it with his life insurance policy. That part was new to me. A wave of love and sorrow washed over me, so potent it stole my breath. Caleb leaned forward. Could the property assets be consolidated into a family LLC for more efficient management? He asked, his voice strained. "The will is final, Miss." Reed repeated, her tone unwavering. Sloane produced a printout of their Blackwood experience pitch. Could the trust be leveraged to fund the initial renovations? No, Miss Reed said, not without, Miss Reed said. Not. The unanimous consent of all beneficiaries, which includes Leo's legal guardian and the trustee, Mr. Finch. Sloane's polished smile finally vanished. Caleb fell silent, his face a mask of fury when he finally spoke. His voice was tight with resentment. "I just want what's best for this family after Miss Tosh Reed left." I walked her to her car. She paused, her hand on the door. "I've handled hundreds of estates, Cordelia," she said softly. "What you're enduring takes a rare kind of courage." I met her gaze. "I'm not done yet," I whispered, because I wasn't the device in my pocket. Held the damning proof of their contempt for their father's memory, and I had every intention of using it that night. I played the recording. I listened to every interruption, every dismissive sigh, every time they twisted Arthur's legacy into a sales pitch. Their voices were so calm, so rational, but beneath the surface was a chilling, calculated entitlement. I saved the file, labeled it the reading, and uploaded it to a secure cloud drive. I then emailed the link to myself, to Miss Reed, and to Mr. Finch. I had learned a vital lesson in the profound silence of my grief. Protecting your peace requires you to prepare for war. The next day I made my calls first to Mr. Finch, the trustee, then to Claire Arthur's sister, and the guardian of my grandson Leo. Claire was a no-nonsense rancher from Eastern Oregon who valued integrity above all else. I didn't editorialize. I simply sent them the link to the audio file within hours. They both called back. Mr. Finch, his voice laced with cold fury, informed me that he would be documenting this as a potential attempt at coercive control over the estate. Claire was more direct. "Those goddamn vultures," she snarled. "Don't you worry, Cordelia. They won't get a damn thing past me or that boy." She assured me she would file a formal objection to any proposal that didn't directly and transparently benefit Leo. Caleb and Sloane were oblivious. They assumed my quiet. Aaron's were signs of a grieving widow's scattered mind. They mistook my silence for weakness. They didn't know I was building a fortress of allies around Arthur's true legacy. That afternoon I found Sloane's tablet left open on the kitchen counter. It was open to their pitch deck. One slide was titled, "Legacy Management, a bullet point. Read, Phase 1. Maternal pacification." I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just greed. It was a cold clinical strategy to manage me, to pacify the grieving mother until they could take control. I didn't confront them. I simply took a photo of the screen with my phone and sent it to Mr. Finch and Claire with a single word proof, but they didn't know. I had also found Arthur's personal journals tucked away in the attic. In them he hadn't written about profit or assets. He had sketched out plans for a small free workshop to teach woodworking to troubled local veterans. He had written about preserving the old growth forest as a nature sanctuary for school children. His real will wasn't in the legal documents. It was in those faded, ink-filled pages. His legacy was one of service, not sales. 2 days later, I called the transition supper. I let them believe they were in control. Brandon printed name cards. Sloane had a gourmet meal catered. They lit candles, poured expensive wine, and prepared to celebrate their victory after the main course. Caleb cleared his throat and launched into their final polished pitch. Sloane passed out glossy brochures. They spoke of revenue streams and brand synergy. I let them finish. The silence that followed was thick with their smug expectation. Then I stood up. My heart was a steady drum. "I appreciate your energy." I began, my voice clear and strong, "but your plans are irrelevant. As of this morning, the deed to the forest acreage and the workshop has been transferred into a charitable foundation established to fulfill Arthur's final wishes." I paused, looking from Caleb's stunned face to Sloane's. "The Blackwood Sanctuary and Veterans Workshop will be managed by a board which includes Mr. Finch, Claire, and myself. It is protected. It is permanent. It is not for sale." Caleb's face went white. "You had no right," he stammered. Sloane's eyes were wide with disbelief. "Our inheritance, your monetary inheritance as outlined in the legal, will remain untouched," I said calmly. "But the land, the soul of this place, the part of your father you sought to desecrate and sell, is now beyond your reach. It will be used to heal, not to profit. That was his true legacy." The room was utterly silent. The candles flickered, casting long dancing shadows on their stricken faces. They left without another word, their catered food growing cold on the table. I sat alone in the quiet dining room for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had kept my word. I had honored my love. The next morning, the house was still. They had gone, leaving behind nothing but the lingering scent of their expensive candle. Later that day, I met the first group of volunteers for the workshop, 3 veterans, their faces etched with stories. I could only imagine. One of them, a man with kind eyes, ran his hand over the rough timber of the workshop wall. "Arthur was a good man," he said softly. He would have liked this that evening. I walked out to the edge of the forest as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of lavender and gold. The wind whispered through the ancient firs, a sound like a deep, contented sigh. True inheritance isn't found in a bank account or on a deed. It's the quiet strength, the unwavering integrity, the unspoken promise to tend to what is good and true. I didn't get revenge. I got something far better. I got to see my husband's spirit live on. Not as a brand name on a luxury retreat, but in the grateful silence of a veteran finding purpose in the protected hush of a forest that would now stand for generations. In the end, I didn't just protect his legacy. I became its guardian, and in that sacred duty, I finally found my peace.